In the dusty refugee camps of northern Syria, among thousands of displaced families clutching their few remaining possessions, walked a woman whose gentle demeanor and worn hijab told a story of loss and survival. Aid workers saw her as just another victim of war, a mother separated from her children, seeking safety like countless others. They had no idea that beneath her modest clothing lay the steady hands of one of the most feared snipers in the region, or that her seemingly innocent presence would soon turn the tide of a deadly convoy ambush that threatened to claim dozens of innocent lives. What they witnessed that day would shatter every assumption about who heroes really are, and prove that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. This is the true story of Amira Hassan, the woman who fooled everyone, including her enemies, right until the moment she saved them all. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Za'atari refugee camp as Amira Hassan adjusted her faded blue hijab and picked up the small canvas bag that contained everything she owned in the world. To the casual observer, she looked like any other displaced woman in the camp. Her clothes were dusty and worn. Her face showed the strain of someone who had lost everything. And she moved with the careful, measured steps of someone who had learned to make herself invisible. But appearances, as Amira knew better than most, could be devastatingly deceiving. She had arrived at the camp 3 weeks earlier, claiming to be a widow from Aleppo whose husband had been killed in an airstrike. The story was partially true. There had indeed been an airstrike, and someone had died that day. What she didn't mention was that she had been the one providing targeting coordinates from a rooftop 2 kilometers away, and the man who died had been a high-ranking terrorist leader whose elimination had saved hundreds of civilian lives. Amira Hassan wasn't just another refugee. She was Lieutenant Amira Hassan of the Syrian Democratic Forces, one of the most skilled snipers in the entire Middle East conflict. Her official record showed 47 confirmed kills, all high-value targets, all eliminated with surgical precision that had earned her the nickname Silent Storm among her unit. But those numbers didn't tell the whole story of who she really was, or why she was now walking among refugees instead of fighting on the front lines. The transformation had begun 6 months earlier when her commanding officer, Colonel Rashid, had called her into his tent with an unusual assignment. Intelligence had been tracking a weapons trafficking operation that was using refugee convoys as cover to move advanced military equipment across the border. The operation was sophisticated. They had people embedded within legitimate humanitarian organizations, and they were using the international protection afforded to refugee convoys to move everything from advanced sniper rifles to rocket-propelled grenades. "We need someone inside," Colonel Rashid had explained, spreading aerial photographs across his desk. "Someone who can blend in completely, gather intelligence, and be ready to act if necessary. The problem is, this isn't a typical infiltration mission. You need to disappear completely. No backup, no communication, no extraction plan until the mission is complete." Amira had studied the photographs, showing long lines of refugees trudging along dusty roads, families carrying children and pushing carts loaded with their possessions. Among them, according to intelligence reports, were armed smugglers moving millions of dollars worth of weapons that would ultimately end up in the hands of terrorist organizations. "How long?" she had asked. "Could be weeks. Could be months. We don't know when they'll make their move, but when they do, innocent people are going to be caught in the crossfire. These convoys carry real refugees, families, children, elderly people who have already lost everything. If shooting starts, it'll be a massacre." The decision hadn't been difficult. Amira had grown up in a small village outside Damascus, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a seamstress. She had learned to shoot from her grandfather, who had fought in the 6-Day War, and believed that everyone should know how to protect themselves. But it wasn't until her own village was attacked, until she had watched neighbors and friends die while she hid in a basement, that she truly understood what her skills were meant for. She had joined the Syrian Democratic Forces not for politics or ideology, but for the simple reason that she couldn't stand by and watch innocent people suffer when she had the ability to stop it. Every target in her scope represented lives that could be saved, families that could stay together, children who could grow up in peace. So she had agreed to the mission, knowing it would mean cutting all ties with her old life, at least temporarily. She had spent weeks studying refugee testimonies, learning the speech patterns and mannerisms of displaced persons, understanding the psychological markers that would make her story believable. She had practiced walking differently, holding herself with the subtle signs of someone who had endured trauma and loss. Most importantly, she had learned to hide the confidence and alertness that marked her as a trained soldier. The hardest part hadn't been learning to act helpless. It had been disassembling her custom sniper rifle and hiding the components in everyday objects that a refugee might reasonably carry. The stock became part of a walking cane for her fictitious elderly father. The barrel was hidden inside a hollow metal water pipe. The scope was disguised as a broken pair of binoculars, its precision lenses appearing cracked and useless to anyone who didn't know what they were really looking at. Her entry into the refugee system had been carefully orchestrated. She had approached a legitimate checkpoint at dawn, claiming to have walked for 3 days after escaping an attack on her village. The story she told was a composite of real events that had happened to other refugees, details gathered from intelligence reports, and debriefings that made her account both heartbreaking and entirely believable. The aid workers who processed her paperwork had been kind but overwhelmed, dealing with hundreds of new arrivals every day. They had asked the standard questions: name, place of origin, family members, any special needs or medical conditions, and had filed her papers alongside dozens of others. Within hours, she was just another face in the crowd, another tragedy among thousands. Life in the refugee camp had been an education in human resilience. She shared a tent with 3 other women: Fatima, who had lost her husband and 2 sons in a bombing; Layla, whose village had been overrun and who hadn't heard from her family in 6 months; and Yasmin, a teenager who had been separated from her parents during an evacuation and was trying to find them through the various refugee networks. Listening to their stories had been harder than any combat mission. These women had endured losses that would have broken most people, yet they got up every morning, stood in line for food rations, helped care for other people's children, and never stopped hoping that tomorrow might bring news of missing family members or the chance to build new lives. Amira had found herself genuinely caring about her tent mates, even as she maintained her cover. She helped Fatima with her medication. The older woman suffered from diabetes, and the refugee medical system was overwhelmed. She taught Layla basic English, knowing that language skills might help her if she eventually made it to a resettlement country. She listened to Yasmin practice the speech she hoped to give to refugee advocates, asking for help finding her parents. But even as she integrated into refugee life, Amira never stopped watching and listening. She mapped the camp layout, noting which areas had the best sight lines and which routes would allow for quick movement. She identified the camp security personnel and their patrol patterns. Most importantly, she watched the other refugees, looking for anyone who didn't quite fit the pattern. It had taken nearly 2 weeks before she spotted them. A group of 5 men who claimed to be from different villages, but who had clearly worked together before. They were subtle about it, never acknowledging each other directly, maintaining their individual cover stories. But Amira's trained eye caught the small signs. The way they positioned themselves to maintain visual contact across the camp. The fact that they all seemed unusually well-fed and healthy for people who claimed to have been walking for weeks. Most tellingly, the way they moved with the unconscious awareness and controlled aggression of trained fighters trying to appear harmless. She had begun following them discreetly, noting their meeting patterns and contact procedures. They were using a system of dead drops, leaving messages and receiving instructions through seemingly innocent interactions with camp vendors and volunteers. It was sophisticated enough to avoid detection by camp security, but not sophisticated enough to fool someone who knew what to look for. The breakthrough had come when she overheard a fragment of conversation between two of them near the camp latrines. They had been speaking in Arabic, but using terminology that revealed their military background. One had mentioned the next shipment and highway coordinates, while the other had responded with something about covering fire positions. That night, as her tent mates slept, Amira had carefully extracted one component of her rifle and used its telescopic capabilities to conduct detailed surveillance of the suspected smugglers. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. They weren't just planning to move weapons through a refugee convoy. They were planning to hijack one. The plan, as she gradually pieced it together over the following days, was elegant in its ruthlessness. The smugglers would embed themselves in a legitimate refugee convoy, one of the large, organized movements that traveled with international oversight and protection. Partway through the journey, at a predetermined location, they would signal Confederates positioned along the route. The convoy would be stopped, supposedly for document checks, and during the confusion, vehicles loaded with weapons would be switched in for vehicles carrying legitimate refugees. Anyone who witnessed the switch, or who might be able to identify the smugglers later, would simply disappear. The remaining refugees would be allowed to continue their journey, traumatized and confused but alive. The smugglers would have their weapons, and the international community would write off any missing persons as another tragic consequence of the refugee crisis. It was a plan that relied entirely on the world's willingness to look the other way when refugees disappeared, and on the assumption that no one in the convoy would be capable of fighting back. They had underestimated the woman in the faded blue hijab. Amira had spent the next several days making her own preparations. She had gradually retrieved the hidden components of her rifle, reassembling it in stages, and hiding it in a specially modified refugee cart that she had acquired by trading some of her food rations. She had identified the likely route for the next major convoy movement by listening to conversations among camp administrators. Most importantly, she had positioned herself to be included in that convoy by volunteering to help care for elderly and sick refugees during the journey. The morning of departure had arrived gray and cold, with a harsh wind blowing dust across the camp. Amira had helped load the convoy vehicles, carefully placing her disguised rifle cart among the medical supplies where it would be both accessible and inconspicuous. She had said goodbye to her tent mates, promising to write once she reached her supposed destination, knowing that if everything went according to plan, she would never see them again. As the convoy rolled out of the camp, past the security checkpoints, and onto the open road, Amira had settled in among the genuine refugees, maintaining her cover even as she mentally cataloged every possible firing position along the route. She knew that somewhere ahead, the men she had been watching were preparing to spring their trap. What they didn't know was that their trap was about to become their grave. The convoy stretched for nearly a kilometer, consisting of 37 vehicles carrying over 400 refugees. There were buses packed with families, trucks loaded with belongings, and several vehicles designated for medical cases and elderly passengers. The entire column moved slowly, never exceeding 30 kilometers per hour, with international observers in marked vehicles positioned at regular intervals along its length. Amira rode in the 15th vehicle, a converted truck that had been fitted with benches along both sides. She sat near the rear, her small bag of possessions at her feet and her walking cane, which concealed the rifle stock, resting against her shoulder. To her fellow passengers, she appeared to be dozing, but her eyes were constantly scanning the landscape ahead, looking for the killing ground she knew was waiting somewhere along the route. The attack, when it came, would be swift and overwhelming. But Amira Hassan, the woman who had fooled everyone about who she really was, would be ready. The convoy had been traveling for 6 hours when the landscape began to change. The flat, dusty plains gave way to rolling hills dotted with ancient olive trees and rocky outcroppings that provided natural cover for anyone wanting to remain unseen. Amira recognized the tactical significance of the terrain immediately. This was perfect ambush country, with elevated positions offering commanding views of the road and multiple escape routes for attackers. She had been tracking their progress on a small map hidden inside her bag, cross-referencing their location with the intelligence reports she had memorized before beginning the mission. According to her calculations, they were approaching the most likely location for an attack, a narrow valley where the road curved sharply around a hill, creating a natural bottleneck that would force the convoy to slow down and bunch up. The other passengers in her truck had grown quiet as the day wore on. The initial excitement of leaving the camp had given way to the grinding fatigue of travel and the anxiety that came with venturing into the unknown. Children slept against their parents' shoulders, elderly passengers dozed fitfully, and everyone seemed to be lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. Amira used their distraction to her advantage, carefully adjusting the position of her concealed rifle components and making final mental preparations for what she knew was coming. She had identified the 5 smugglers she had been tracking. They were distributed across 3 different vehicles in the convoy, positioned to coordinate their actions once the attack began. 2 were in a bus near the front of the column, 1 was in a supply truck in the middle, and 2 more were in a passenger vehicle toward the rear. What worried her most was what she didn't know. How many Confederates were waiting along the route? What kind of weapons did they have? How many innocent people would be caught in the crossfire before she could neutralize the threat? These were the variables that kept professional soldiers awake at night, the unknowns that could turn a successful mission into a catastrophe. The first sign of trouble came when the convoy began to slow unexpectedly. Amira looked ahead and saw that the lead vehicles were approaching a checkpoint that hadn't been there on their route map, a temporary structure consisting of concrete barriers and armed men wearing mismatched uniforms that could have belonged to any of a dozen different factions in the region. Document check. The driver of her truck called back to the passengers, but Amira could hear the uncertainty in his voice. This wasn't a scheduled stop, and everyone in the convoy leadership would know it. As their vehicle came to a complete halt, Amira began to move. Her transformation from helpless refugee to deadly operative happened in stages, each action carefully disguised as the nervous fidgeting of a frightened woman. She retrieved the scope from her bag, ostensibly looking for identity papers. She shifted the walking cane to a position where she could quickly access the rifle stock hidden inside. Most importantly, she began scanning the hills around them, looking for the muzzle flashes and movement patterns that would tell her where the real attack was coming from. The checkpoint guards were professional in their movements, too professional for a routine document inspection. They approached each vehicle in a coordinated pattern, with some guards maintaining overwatch positions while others conducted searches. But Amira noticed something that the other refugees wouldn't have caught. The guards weren't really looking at the documents they were checking. They were looking at faces, comparing passengers to photographs or descriptions they had been given. They were looking for someone specific. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just about weapons smuggling. They were after her. Somehow, her cover had been blown, and this entire elaborate setup was designed to capture or eliminate the Syrian Democratic Forces operative they knew was hidden among the refugees. But if that was true, why hadn't they simply surrounded her vehicle and demanded her surrender? Why go through the charade of a checkpoint inspection? The answer came to her as she watched the guards' movements more carefully. They were looking for someone, but they weren't sure exactly who they were looking for. They had intelligence that there was an infiltrator in the convoy, but they didn't have enough information to identify her specifically. The checkpoint was a screening operation. They would check everyone until they found someone who didn't fit the refugee profile, which meant she still had the element of surprise, at least for a few more minutes. The guard who approached their truck was young, probably no more than 25, with the nervous energy of someone trying to prove himself. He climbed aboard and began working his way down the rows of passengers, checking papers and studying faces. When he reached the elderly man sitting next to Amira, she made her move. "Please, sir," she said in the trembling voice she had perfected during her weeks in the refugee camp. "My father is very sick. Can we get him some water?" The guard looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and annoyance that she had been counting on. To him, she was just another whining refugee, another problem to be dealt with quickly so he could get back to his real job. He glanced at her papers dismissively and was about to move on when something made him pause. Later, Amira would realize that it was probably her hands that had given her away. Despite weeks of refugee life, despite her carefully cultivated appearance of weakness and desperation, her hands still showed the telltale signs of someone who handled weapons professionally. The calluses were in the wrong places, the muscle development was too specific, and there was a steadiness to her grip that no amount of acting could completely disguise. The guard's expression changed, and his hand moved toward the radio clipped to his vest. That was when Amira struck. Her left hand shot out and clamped over the guard's mouth before he could speak in his radio, while her right hand found the pressure point on his neck that would render him unconscious in seconds. But even as she moved, she knew that her cover was blown completely now. Other passengers in the truck had seen what she did, and their shocked gasps and cries would alert every guard within 100 meters. The firefight began before the unconscious guard had even hit the floor of the truck. The sound of automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions around the convoy simultaneously. The checkpoint guards, who had been waiting for a signal from their colleague, opened fire on the vehicles when they heard the commotion. But more dangerous were the hidden shooters positioned in the hills, the real ambush team that had been waiting for the convoy to be stopped and bunched up in the killing zone. Refugees screamed and dove for cover as bullets shattered windows and punched through the thin metal sides of trucks and buses. Parents threw themselves over their children. Elderly passengers collapsed in terror, and the careful order of the convoy dissolved into chaos and panic. But Amira was no longer thinking like a refugee. She threw herself out the back of the truck, taking her concealed rifle components with her, and rolled behind the vehicle's rear wheels for cover. Around her, people were running in all directions, some trying to flee the vehicles, and others try to get back inside them. The international observers who were supposed to protect the convoy were scrambling for their own weapons and radios, trying to coordinate a response to an attack they had never expected. Working with practiced efficiency, Amira assembled her rifle in under 30 seconds, even as bullets whistled overhead and ricocheted off the truck's frame. The custom weapon came together like a precision instrument, each component fitting perfectly into place. When she raised it to her shoulder and looked through the scope, she was no longer Amira the refugee. She was Silent Storm, and she had work to do. The first target was a sniper positioned on a rocky outcropping about 400 meters to the east. Through her scope, she could see him methodically firing into the convoy, targeting anyone who looked like they might be armed or in a position of authority. He was good, his shots were precise, and he had chosen his position well. But he had made the fatal mistake of assuming that there was no one in the convoy capable of shooting back. Amira's first shot took him in the center of the chest, the 7.62 millimeters round traveling across the valley in less than half a second. The sniper fell backward off his rocky perch, his rifle clattering down the hillside. The second target was a machine gun team positioned behind a stone wall about 200 meters to the west. They were laying down suppressive fire across the entire convoy, preventing anyone from moving or organizing a defense. Through her scope, Amira could see 3 men, one firing the weapon, one feeding ammunition, and one spotting targets. She took the gunner first, then the spotter, then the ammunition handler, 3 shots in rapid succession that silenced the machine gun and eliminated the immediate threat to the convoy's left flank. But even as she worked, Amira was aware that this was only the beginning. The attack had been planned with military precision, and the shooters she could see were just the ones who had revealed their positions by firing. There were certainly others probably moving to new positions right now, and the checkpoint guard were still a threat at close range. As if summoned by her thoughts, she heard footsteps approaching her position from behind. She spun around to find one of the checkpoint guards advancing on her location, his assault rifle raised and ready to fire. For a split second, they stared at each other across 15 meters of dusty ground. The guard in his military surplus uniform and the woman in refugee clothes holding a sniper rifle. Then, both of them moved at once. The guard was fast, and his weapon was already aimed in her direction, but Amira had been in too many life-or-death situations to hesitate now. She dropped to one knee and fired from the hip, not bothering to use her scope at such close range. The shot caught the guard in the shoulder and spun him around, causing his return fire to go wide. Before he could recover, she was moving again, using the truck as cover while she worked the bolt of her rifle and chambered another round. The wounded guard was trying to bring his weapon back around when her second shot found its mark, ending the immediate threat. But the sound of the close-range firefight had attracted attention from other quarters. Through the chaos and noise of the ongoing battle, Amira could hear voices coordinating in Arabic. Some of the other attackers were moving to surround her position. She looked around desperately for better cover or an escape route, but found herself in an increasingly impossible tactical situation. She was in the middle of an open area with limited concealment, facing an unknown number of enemies who were coordinating their movements to trap her. Worse, she was surrounded by hundreds of innocent refugees who were depending on her to stop the attack, even though most of them didn't even know who she was or what she was doing. That was when she heard the voice calling her name. Amira. Amira Hassan. We know who you are. The voice was speaking Arabic with a Damascus accent, and it was coming from somewhere near the front of the convoy. Someone with a bullhorn was trying to negotiate with her, even as the firefight continued around them. You cannot save them all, the voice continued. Surrender now, and we will let the refugees go. Continue fighting, and everyone dies. It was a standard psychological warfare tactic, put the operative in a position where they had to choose between their mission and innocent lives, then exploit whatever decision they made. If she surrendered, they would kill her and probably most of the refugees anyway. If she continued fighting, they would use the threat of civilian casualties to limit her options and eventually overwhelm her position. But Amira had spent too many years fighting in this war to fall for such transparent manipulation. She knew that these men had already decided to kill everyone in the convoy, that had probably been part of their plan from the beginning. The only difference her surrender would make was that it would happen sooner rather than later. So instead of responding to the voice, she did what she did best. She found her next target through her rifle scope and eliminated the threat with a single, perfectly placed shot. The battle for the convoy was far from over, but now at least it was a fair fight. And when it came to fair fights, Silent Storm had never lost one yet. The man with the bullhorn had made a critical mistake by revealing his position. Amira tracked the sound through her scope and found him crouched behind an overturned car about 150 meters away, clearly believing that his improvised cover would protect him from return fire. He was wrong. Her shot shattered the car's rear window and found its target with surgical precision. The bullhorn clattered to the ground, and with it went the psychological pressure the attackers had been trying to apply. Now it was simply a matter of superior marksmanship and tactical thinking, areas where Amira held every advantage. But as she worked her way through the visible targets, she became aware of a more complex problem developing around her. The convoy had been stopped in a valley with steep sides and limited escape routes, creating a natural killing ground for the attackers. However, the same terrain features that made it perfect for an ambush also created opportunities for a skilled defensive fighter, if she could get a higher ground. The challenge was that reaching the high ground would mean leaving the refugees more exposed to enemy fire. Every instinct she had as a soldier told her to seek the tactical advantage of elevation and clear fields of fire, but every instinct she had as a human being told her to stay close to the people she was trying to protect. The decision was made for her when she spotted movement in her peripheral vision. 3 more attackers were approaching the convoy from the rear, moving in a coordinated pattern that would bring them behind the position where most of the refugees had taken cover. If they reached those positions, the result would be a massacre. Amira made a running leap over the truck she had been using for cover and sprinted toward the rear of the convoy, her rifle in her hands, and her mind already calculating angles and distances. The refugees who saw her move probably thought she was running away from the fight, but she was actually running toward the most dangerous part of it. The first of the 3 attackers saw her coming and tried to bring his weapon around to engage her, but he was thinking like someone attacking helpless refugees, not like someone facing a trained sniper in close combat. Amira's shot took him down before he could complete his turn, and she was already moving toward cover behind another vehicle before his body hit the ground. The second attacker was smarter. He took cover behind a large boulder and tried to pin her down with suppressive fire while his partner moved to flank her position. It was a sound tactic that might have worked against most opponents, but Amira had been in similar situations dozens of times before. Instead of staying behind cover and allowing herself to be flanked, she did something that her opponents would never expect from a lone sniper. She attacked. Using the boulder as concealment from the third man, she rushed the second attacker's position, firing as she moved. Her first shot forced him to duck down behind his cover, and her second shot, fired from an angle he hadn't been expecting, ended the threat permanently. The third man, seeing his partners eliminated in rapid succession, made the mistake that many fighters make when facing an unexpectedly skilled opponent. he panicked. Instead of using his training and maintaining his position, he broke cover and ran for what he thought was a better fighting position further up the hill. Running in the open against a sniper was suicide, and Amira's shot dropped him after he had covered less than 20 meters. But even as she eliminated the immediate threats to the rear of the convoy, she could see that the overall tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. More attackers were moving down from the hills, and some of them were carrying heavy weapons that could destroy the convoy vehicles and kill dozens of refugees with single shots. Most critically, she spotted a team setting up what appeared to be a mortar position on a ridge about 800 meters away. If they succeeded in getting that weapon operational, they could rain high-explosive shells down on the entire convoy from a position that would be almost impossible for her to engage with a sniper rifle. The range was at the extreme limit of her weapon's effective capability, and the target would be partially concealed behind a ridgeline. Worse, she would only get one chance. The sound of her shot would alert them to the threat, and they would immediately shift positions or accelerate their setup timeline. Amira found the steadiest firing position she could manage, bracing her rifle against the side of a truck and calculating the ballistic solution in her head. 800 meters, slight upward angle, wind coming from the west at approximately 10 kilometers per hour, target partially concealed behind cover. She controlled her breathing and let her heart rate settle into the calm rhythm that she had trained herself to achieve in high-stress situations. Through her scope, she could see two men working frantically to assemble the mortar while a third man spotted for targets in the convoy below. The shot would have to be perfect. She squeezed the trigger with the smooth, practiced motion that had become as natural as breathing, and watched through her scope as the bullet traveled across the valley in an arc that took it just over the ridge line and into the center of the mortar team's position. The explosion that followed was much larger than a single rifle bullet should have caused, and it took Amira a moment to realize what had happened. Her shot had struck either a mortar round or an ammunition cache, detonating the team's own explosives and eliminating the entire position in a fireball that could be seen for kilometers. The psychological effect of the explosion on the remaining attackers was immediate and decisive. They had been told they were facing a convoy of helpless refugees with minimal security, not a precision sniper who could reach out and destroy fortified positions at extreme range. Several of them broke off their attacks immediately, retreating to positions further from the convoy. But the most important effect was on the 5 smugglers who had embedded themselves in the convoy and were supposed to coordinate the attack from the inside. They had been waiting for the outside attack to succeed before revealing themselves, but the sight of their comrades being systematically eliminated by an unknown defender forced them to act prematurely. Amira spotted the first one when he emerged from a refugee bus near the front of the convoy, carrying an assault rifle that he had somehow concealed during the journey from the camp. He was shouting orders in Arabic, trying to coordinate the remaining external attackers, which made him easy to locate and target. Her shot silenced him mid-sentence, but it also alerted the other 4 smugglers to her position. They began moving through the convoy, using the refugees as human shields while they tried to get close enough to eliminate her with small arms fire. This was the scenario that Amira had been dreading, a close-quarters battle fought among hundreds of innocent civilians. Every shot she took risked hitting a refugee, and every shot she didn't take allowed the smugglers to get closer to their own targets. The solution came to her when she realized that the refugees themselves could be her allies in this fight. Most of them had figured out by now that the woman who had seemed like just another displaced person was actually their defender, and many of them were actively trying to help her by pointing out the locations of armed men or creating obstacles for the attackers. When one of the smugglers tried to use a family with small children as cover while approaching her position, the father of that family deliberately tripped the gunman, sending him sprawling on the ground where Amira could engage him safely. When another smuggler tried to hide behind a group of elderly refugees, one of the women in that group loudly called out his position in Arabic, giving Amira the information she needed to track him through her scope. The refugees had recognized that this was their fight too, and they were willing to take risks to help the person who was risking everything to save them. The last two smugglers, realizing that their cover was blown and their mission had failed, made a final desperate attempt to complete at least part of their objective. Instead of trying to fight their way out, they grabbed the weapons cache that had been hidden in one of the convoy supply trucks and attempted to destroy it with grenades, apparently preferring to deny the weapons to their enemies rather than allow them to be captured. But Amira had been tracking the location of that cache since her first day of surveillance in a refugee camp. Her final two shots of the battle prevented the destruction of the evidence that would be needed to unravel the entire smuggling network. As the echoes of gunfire faded across the valley, an eerie silence settled over the convoy. Refugees began emerging from their hiding places, looking around in amazement at the fact that they were still alive. The international observers who had been cowering behind their vehicles during the firefight began to venture out and assess the damage. And in the middle of it all stood Amira Hassan, still wearing her faded blue hijab, still holding the rifle that had saved them all. The aftermath of the battle was almost as surreal as the battle itself. Military units arrived within hours, having been alerted by the international observers' radio calls, and found a scene that defied easy explanation. The convoy vehicles were shot full of holes, and the surrounding hills were littered with the bodies of more than 20 attackers. Yet somehow the refugee casualties were minimal, a few wounded, but no deaths among the innocent civilians. The weapons cache that the smugglers had been trying to move turned out to be even more significant than intelligence had predicted. In addition to the small arms and ammunition they had expected to find, investigators discovered advanced anti-aircraft missiles, military-grade explosives, and communications equipment that could have been used to coordinate terrorist attacks across multiple countries. But perhaps the most important discovery was a laptop computer that contained the names, locations, and operational details of the entire weapons smuggling network. The intelligence gathered from that single computer led to coordinated raids across 3 countries that rolled up dozens of operatives and prevented attacks that could have killed hundreds of people. Amira's official debriefing took place in a military base hundreds of kilometers from the ambush site. She had shed her refugee disguise and was back in her military uniform, but somehow she didn't feel like the same person who had accepted the mission months earlier. The mission was a complete success, Colonel Rashid told her as he reviewed her report. The smuggling network has been dismantled. We've prevented those weapons from reaching terrorist organizations, and you've saved the lives of over 400 refugees. You should be proud of what you've accomplished. But when Amira thought about the mission, pride wasn't the primary emotion she felt. Instead, she found herself thinking about Fatima, Layla, and Yasmin, the women who had shared her tent in the refugee camp, who had welcomed her into their makeshift family without question, who had trusted her with their stories and their hopes for the future. They had been real refugees facing real hardships, and their kindness to a stranger had been genuine and selfless. By comparison, her own deception, necessary though it had been, felt like a betrayal of that trust. "What happens to the convoy now?" she asked Colonel Rashid. "They've been moved to a secure location for processing. Most of them will be resettled within a few weeks. Some have family in other countries. Others will be placed with refugee assistance programs. They'll rebuild their lives, eventually, and they'll never know the truth about what really happened that day. Colonel Rashid shrugged. The official story is that the convoy was attacked by bandits and defended by international security personnel. It's cleaner that way, less questions from the media, less political complications. Better for everyone involved. Amira nodded, understanding the logic even if she didn't entirely agree with it. In the world of military intelligence, the truth was often too complicated for public consumption, and the people who did the hardest jobs were usually the ones whose contributions could never be officially acknowledged. But she also knew that the refugees themselves would remember what they had seen. They would remember the woman in the blue hijab who had appeared to be just another displaced person, right up until the moment she saved all their lives. They would tell their children and their grandchildren about the day when their guardian angel had worn the face of someone just like them. In the months that followed, Amira returned to her regular duties with the Syrian Democratic Forces, participating in operations that gradually pushed back the terrorist organizations and brought stability to more areas of the country. She earned additional commendations and was eventually promoted to the rank of captain, though she continued to prefer field operations to administrative duties. But sometimes, when she was alone with her thoughts, she would remember the convoy battle and wonder about the people she had saved. Had Fatima found treatment for her diabetes? Had Layla been reunited with her family? Had Yasmin found her parents? She never knew for certain, but she liked to believe that somewhere in refugee settlements or resettlement countries around the world, those women were building new lives and telling the story of the day when salvation had come from the most unexpected source. The story of the woman who had masqueraded as a refugee and became the deadly sniper who saved the convoy had become legend among the people who lived through it. But for Amira Hassan, it would always be remembered as the day she learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for ideology or politics, but simply to protect the innocent people who deserve a chance to live their lives in peace. Years later, when the war was over and she had returned to civilian life, Amira would sometimes visit refugee camps as a volunteer, helping to provide medical care and educational services to displaced families. She never used her real name or revealed her military background, preferring to work quietly and anonymously. But occasionally, she would meet someone, usually an older woman, who would look at her with a mixture of recognition and gratitude, as if remembering a face from a day when the impossible had happened and everyone had lived to tell about it. In those moments, Amira would simply smile and continue with her work, knowing that some stories were more powerful when they remained untold, and some heroes were most effective when they remained hidden among the people they had sworn to protect. The woman who had once been Silent Storm had found her truest calling not in the acclaim of military victories, but in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that innocent people were alive and safe because she had been willing to risk everything to protect them, and that she had learned was the most important victory of all.